Well, thank you all for joining. So this is our next Sport and the Growing Good session. So in these sessions we talk about different aspects of sport and how the good that comes from sport and how we can think more deeply about it and help spread the good in sport. This week's short discussion here is based on one little blog post where we talked about kind of youth sports and particularly youth basketball, but I think a lot of the trends in youth sport go across sport. And in that article we talked about some kind of the really good parts of youth sport and some of the kind of challenging things we're dealing with a lot. I'd like to, in this short discussion, focus on this idea of professionalization in youth sport and how this has been in the news a lot, it's been written a lot about. We have Chris McIntosh here to help us in that conversation, has great perspective. But I want to start off, before I ask Chris a few questions, I want to start off with some stats, some data. So one thing I think we all know how popular sports are for kids in the U.S. and why a lot of families do it. A number that we might think about is that 90% of kids in the U.S., this is all kids, 90% of kids participate in some formal sport between ages 5 and 17. So between ages 5 and 17, 90% of kids in the U.S. participate in formal sporting experience, which is, that's unique. There's no other kind of out-of-school thing that 90% of kids do. Not 90% of kids go to church, not 90% of kids do music or arts, but 90% of kids do athletics at some point. Another trend that's kind of not hidden is that sports are increasingly separated from school. So whereas a lot of us in this room maybe had our main sport experiences as part of our 6th grade class experience or our even high school experience, increasingly like the most serious youth sport are in a club setting or not at all related to what's going on in school. So there are a lot of things we can say about that, but that's a major trend in the last 10 years that we see. A third thing to think about is even when sports are attached to school, so kids go to school and play in their school team, there's a trend that many of these schooling experiences are not traditional schooling experiences. So especially we see this in the basketball world where we see a lot of kind of high-level basketball players, some we know, some of us may have even fit in that category, who are going to their traditional high school, and then when they get to a certain level, they leave that school and they go to a school that's viewed as kind of like an academy or a basketball school. It may include a move out of state to Florida or to some other place. So even in those situations where technically the sport is still attached to school, it is in some ways removed from schooling. What I mean by that is like they're still playing for the school team, but it's a different type. It's not the traditional kind of public schooling experience that we all think about. And then a fourth thing to say that I want to set the stage with is that when we look at parental behavior relating to sports, there's a lot written about parents in youth sport, and a lot of it's negative. A lot of it's about how parents get out of control and do things they do at games. We see viral videos about that. But kind of a deeper statistic that underlies a lot of it, it's kind of jarring in some ways, is that when you look at parental behavior, like with their finances, it jumps out at me as kind of almost hard to believe. If you look at over the last 5 years or so, if you look at parents involved in youth sport, they spend 3 to 12% of household income on their kids' sporting. 3 to 12% of their household income on kids' sports, and just over 6% of their household income goes to savings. So for a lot of families, they're spending up to double the amount on their kids playing on the travel team or on getting the right shoes or equipment or all these things than they're spending on actually like their long-term future and savings. So, and especially we see as you get toward kind of lower, middle income and lower income, those proportions even go up higher. So you have a lot of families who have nothing, no percent of their income going to savings, in north of 15% on youth sport. So you could look at that and you could say, well, that's just like financially not a prudent thing to do. But there's also this kind of other factor about the nature of the kid and the kid's experience in sport and what the kid is getting out of the sport and what the kid is thinking she or he should be getting out of the sport. So when parents are making those investments, as the proportion of income goes higher and higher, there's some data that suggests that the kids' pressure gets higher and higher. If I know my mom and dad are, working 2 jobs and we don't have everything we need, and yet they're still putting this time and money and resources into me being on this team, I take on something different from that experience than I would if it was just me playing for the local 7th grade team. So that's a long discussion that we could have about the implications of that. On one hand, I would just say that I think it'd be easy for us just to say that's bad, that's a horrible decision by parents. But one thing I'd like to discuss in this is if it's in what ways is it bad, and in what ways isn't it bad? Like, is there some good in this that can come out of this discussion? And what do we need to think about as parents, as coaches, as leaders, of the implications of this of these things I just shared? So Chris has a great perspective in this. Not only that he is he's an athletic administrator at the university and works with hundreds and hundreds of athletes, but has, and also is a father of active youth involved in high-level sport, but also, has participated in sport, just a lot of experience, but also has himself been a high levels of sport, including as a professional football player. Without going into your big biography, I'm not going to do that. But I want to ask you, Mac, to start, this idea of looking at an athlete as an investment. So when we talk about parents involving, or it's parents putting all this income into their kids, it's an investment. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I invest in my kids in a lot of ways, and I'm willing to do that. I want to do that. Before we get into the youth scene, can you talk about, as a professional athlete, what a team invests in an athlete shapes the way that they view that person? So in other words, if you were a first-round draft pick in the NFL draft, highly regarded, were you viewed differently by the team, treated differently, and in what ways than, say, a free agent signee or someone that didn't necessarily expect much of?
Yeah. My own experience caused me to believe that there was a different reality for high round draft picks. You mentioned I was the 22nd pick of the draft, and with that, there's a reason why there's very few first round draft picks, and usually those types of picks, or those high picks, are expected to fill a void immediately. And so a team makes an investment into a player like that that's going to fill a need quickly. They're not making that investment. Usually, quarterbacks might be a little different, but they're not making that investment to develop a player so that 3 years from now or 5 years from now, that player is going to provide a return. It's a very immediate need that needs to be filled. And that was my experience. I was drafted to play right tackle, even though it was a position I actually never had played. I was a left tackle. But there's a void there, and it needs to be filled, and that's what the team needs. That's what they're buying.
Yeah.
They're buying it. And like any other decision that we make when we buy something, we want something in return for that. And so it was very clearly a kind of commercial exchange or transaction, and which was fine. That's what being a pro is all about. Yeah. That was the first time in my life that there was a distinction between those two. And with that came a pressure from the franchise, from the Seahawks, but as much or even more than a pressure that I put on myself to deliver up to those expectations. And I think a lot of a common thread between these kind of narratives that you're talking about are expectations. What are the expectations? Both in my case, the franchise, but also of myself, and I think where we're likely to go with what parents' expectations are.
Yeah. The pro sports, just the word pro sports, for profit. Like, so you're there, it's a business, right? You always hear that in sport. How is that communicated at the college, at the pro level? How is the kind of the message of what you're there for different at the pro level versus at even the college level?
Yeah. It's very different. I mean, it's one's livelihood.
Yeah.
It's the way one makes a living.
Yeah.
And it was always described to me by teammates that had made the transition from college to the pros as, now it's your job. Which I thought I had understood that, but I in hindsight, I realized that I wasn't as prepared for that as I should have been. When we're making a living at something, we make decisions that are based more on the long-term prospect of our careers. We look at things in a little different way, and if I'm honest with myself, I didn't really view it that way. I probably made decisions that were more aligned with what I had thought had gotten me to that point, which were far more aligned with what I had learned in a college setting, kind of like generically put team first, and kind of my own interests second. And for me, that had a very tangible effect on the duration of my career. I mean, it very clearly cost me a year or two on my career. That in hindsight, had I been aware of that, I probably would have made different decisions.
Came back too quick from injury.
Yeah, played through too many injuries,
Yeah.
And wasn't thinking about how can I prolong my career. It was how do I fill that need,
Yeah.
which is the reason I was drafted in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's a really tough place to be.
This data show that this youth sports industry is now over $15 billion industry. And what I think underlies that so interesting is it's a for-profit industry. It's a $15 billion for-profit industry. So we know what's best for kids, like, is a developmental language. Like, whenever people justify why 90% of kids do sports, if you hear a coach or a parent or an adult justify it, anyone who knows what they're talking about says they have a developmental language. Well, we learn how to work with other people. We learn resilience. We learn discipline. Whatever the language is, it's a language of development. But then that is sitting now more than ever in a context of a commercial language, which is a for-profit language, which is much more closely mirrors the professional setting. So when we talk about the professionalization of youth sport, it's not just the commercialized aspect of it, meaning I don't see anything wrong with people making money off of youth sport. There's a lot worse things to make money off of. What gets, I think, problematic is when the language of commercialization or the commercialized nature of sport goes along with the professional kind of way of working with kids, meaning that I value you based on your performance, like if you're a member of the Seattle Seahawks.
Yep. Yeah, I think one of the potential risks associated with that, especially at the younger ages, is this the trend would be too strong a word, but this potential for a young person, picture a 5th, 6th, 7th grader, to be viewing themselves or their quote, self-worth as a correlation to their productivity in sport. And I think what you're talking about, your value to our club team or your value to our club or whatever, in my case, value to my franchise as a pro, it's sometimes very difficult to disassociate those two things. And I think it's really difficult in a young person for that not to kind of leach into their thought process.
There's this body of work on they call it investor sentiment. So if you're in making an investment in something, like a financial investment, it's kind of obvious, but the more you invest in it, the more money you put in, the more your emotions are tied up in it, and the more what you expect out of it. And that logic, there's a really good article that Travis Dorsch and some of his colleagues were a part of, applies here. So if you're a parent and in that little article I wrote, I'd say, you spend a couple grand easily in a single basketball season for a kid. So all of a sudden you're paying for a hotel night, you're driving across the country for weekends and you're spending all this time, and then you see your kid kind of giving what you think is not hustle effort, and all of a sudden I've invested my time. I took 2 days off of work. I'm spending this money. I bought you those shoes, and you're not giving me that effort. That changes the whole dynamic of what the experience is for the kid and for the adult.
Yeah. I think though, effort, effort is one of the things that a kid can control. Outcome is not.
Yeah.
And I have 3 children, and all 3 of my kids are way down the rabbit hole of club sport, different sports. But I've been really conscious not to put pressure on them in terms of what the outcome is or their achievement is, but rather, for me, sport is about having fun, working hard, and learning, like listening to your coach and learning. Those are the 3 rules in my household for my kids in sport. Beyond that, I really don't care. There's a better way. Like college scholarship is not one of my expectations. Yeah. Actually the money that we put into club sport there'd be a better investment on that if we just invested in and let the markets take care of it. But those 3 things are things that they can learn about sport. So actually, for me personally, effort is one of the things that I do get irritated about on rare occasion when I don't see it. But that's something they control.
Do you think that's detached from what you invest in it? Would you have the same, if you were just at your kid's local high school event, and you hadn't invested anything in it, would you have the same amount of angst over their effort?
It would for me. It would bother me.
Yeah.
But I think one of the challenges with the collective expectations on the kids in club sport, especially at the higher level of team, the higher caliber of team, there's the parent-child expectation, and then there's this expectation that grows within the team or within the club that is, it's probably largely stems from comparison to others.
Yeah.
And my oldest daughter was a freshman last year when she played. A club will have a scholarship offer in a club at an early age, like say a sophomore, and all of a sudden, and I think if you talk to our coaches here, they can tell you, all of a sudden you see something changes within the club, because now all of a sudden there's this expectation, even if it's not coming from the parent, there's an expectation that they place on themselves, that they have to live up to something that many times isn't realistic. It's not even close to being realistic.
So even like if you follow on Twitter a lot of these young prospects, I always get a kick out of the football and basketball guys that they always will have like, blessed to receive offer from, and they keep putting those up, and one kid will have, blessed to receive offer from Wisconsin, blessed to receive offer from, and then name 17 places, and you're just sitting there thinking about the 12 teammates, and they're like, wait, that changes the dynamic quickly on that whole group. How about it? So, I think there are obvious implications. Like we know from research, we know from developmental psychology, developmental, human developmental perspectives that it's not healthy to focus on outcomes. We need to focus like you do on the process. So there are clear implications for parents. We see this, even implications of this at a university campus. So you have 800 student athletes show up who are living this life until they got here, of people who have invested in them for years. You have parents or coaches or other people who have put all this time into each kid. Each kid has been invested in by a lot of people, and they show up on a campus, and a coach now has to work with them. Do you talk to your coaches about this at all? About realizing kind of a shift we've seen as youth sport has professionalized, kids have changed, and therefore does that call for us on our campuses to think about them any differently?
It does. They're certainly armed with a different set of experiences when they get here today. In many sports, they've had all along their own private coaches, advisors, or specialists, if you will. And that's certainly a dynamic that coaches today have to manage far more than they did before. The parental involvement, the parental expectation is far different today than it was.
Even at the college level.
Even at the college level. Yeah. I think if you talk to our coaches, they would tell you they're having far more conversations with parents than they have ever had. which is there's just a certain reality to that.
Which is something you used to hear a lot about high school coaches, but I guess I just, in my experience at the college level, never even saw a parent, heard from a parent.
Yeah,
That's changed.
it has changed. I wonder sometimes, and I don't really, this is more anecdotal than anything else, I wonder sometimes when kids arrive at a program like ours, at a level like ours, if it's viewed as the finish line or the start line. Because clearly, I mean, we're from our position, we're viewing this as the start line. You're going to start this 4 or 5 year experience, and this is what we're going to do, and this is how it's going to shape you on the field, off the field, on the court, off the court, in the classroom. And we've got this whole mission around what we do that really isn't tied to achievement on the field. There's a certain reality that high caliber competition is part of our experience. It shapes our experience here, and I think it goes a long way in building character and all these other traits, but that's not the central mission of what we're doing. But so we're kind of positioned or poised to make this investment, if you will, although that's a term I think that can get kind of twisted. We're going to invest these resources into a young person with this kind of expectation then in 4 or 5 years, we're going to help them for the rest of their life, to kind of grow them. But I scratch my head. Sometimes I wonder, a kid that's been deeply committed to a specific sport since the 2nd grade or 3rd grade, and that's kind of all that's kind of all they know in terms of sport. And then they finally arrive here because this has the potential to be what they're shooting for. Some of them, is this in their mind? Do they take a big sigh of relief and say, "I made it"? But really, the work is just kind of getting started. I know that. I mean, my own personal experience. I saw that in the NFL. I made it. I've been drafted to a team. I made it now. And the ones who do really well in the NFL or in any professional sport really are the ones that get there and say, "Oh, now it's the start. Now I've got to start over." And sometimes I wonder about that here.
That's the scholarship in youth sport. The college D1 scholarship is like the golden thing for so many people. That's what the target is. I think it varies by sport. So there's an article yesterday about Jim Boeheim, the Syracuse coach, saying every guy he gets on his roster thinks he's going to the NBA. So like in basketball, the language from an early time when you're really good, 14, 15, 16 is the language of the NBA. You're going pro, and college might be a stopover for a lot of these guys. It probably varies by sport, I'm assuming, in some ways. There are clear implications here for parents. Use a developmental perspective as much as you can. It's never healthy to have an outcome perspective, especially in the younger ages, but and clearly for coaches as well. I think I would like to close by saying there's some really good things about the way the youth sports are now as well. I think it's so often this perspective gets, it's really easy for everybody to say how bad youth sports are, but you're doing it, I'm doing it with my kids. A lot of us have been involved in that world, and we talked earlier, like we're doing it with our eyes wide open to what it is and what it isn't. And there are a lot of really good things they get exposure to. Right now, a couple of my kids have these outstanding coaches. They have coaches who are like really good people. They're really good teachers, really good instructors. They're around really high quality competition. They're maximizing how good they can be in the sport. They get exposure to great facilities, to great resources. So I mean, I think as we tell one side of the story on this kind of professionalization, I think that there are, I compare that to what my experiences were as a kid, and I didn't get to do a lot of these cool things they're doing. So that I think we got to tell both sides of the story as well.
For sure. I mean, when I watch my kids compete, they're competing at a high level, a level of competition that would have been foreign to what I knew. And that there are tremendous benefits in that. If your expectation is aligned.
I think that's key. What do you want out of it?
I mean, I view that as that's preparing them for down the road in life. That's not preparing them to earn a scholarship. And whatever, I'll be pleasantly surprised if that's the case, but that's not the expectation.
Well, thanks, Mac. It's good
Yeah,
Good chat.
as always.
So this is an issue that will keep becoming an important one for all of us to address, especially at the campus level. I think more and more of those of us who work in the college environment are going to see as that industry below us ramps up, it will more and more be something that will shift the work we do on our college campuses. So.